So welcome to the Brooklyn Park Community Assembly. This is an event we do most for Thursdays. Lately, we've been doing them online, kind of experimenting with that. So like I said, I'm Josie Shardlow. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with the city. And thanks to Claudia Diggs and Natanya Minovar. They're on my team helping me out tonight with this event. And then I also wanted to recognize Councilmember Pa has joined us this evening. I don't know if you want to say a little something, Councilmember Pa. You don't have to, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity. You'll want to unmute though, pardon.
I'm sorry. There we go. This is Councilmember Susan Pa, and it's so great to see all of you here today. It's such an important conversation to have as a community, and so I appreciate everybody being here. We're going to be talking about communities of interest, different neighborhoods and groups that we need to make sure that we include into this conversation and into our thoughts when we think about redistricting. So I'm excited to hear from the presentation, different people that are speaking tonight, and also from community members that are on here today. Thank you, Josie.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if you're just joining us, it'd be great if you put your name and your neighborhood in the chat. And if you don't know your neighborhood, we can put a link to where you can look it up, right? So we want to know who's joining us tonight. And then I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda. We have kind of a packed agenda. There's a lot to say about redistricting. We've got a bunch of amazing presenters tonight. So we're doing a bit of a welcome and overview. Claudia is going to do a nice land acknowledgement. We have Paul Huffman from League of Women Voters talking about redistricting kind of broadly. We're lucky to have Cappy and Acer talking about mapping our communities, a bunch of amazing work they've been doing. And then John Nergi from the city is the GIS coordinator. He's going to share the 2020 census results. So some of you were really involved with census organizing, and now we finally can see the results of all that work. And then we have members of the BP Charter Commission Subcommittee on Redistricting, and they're going to share about what that's going to look like in Brooklyn Park. And of course, we want to save time for all of your questions, and then we have some questions for you. We always want this to be kind of a two-way street as much as possible, right? And then we'll close it out. We do have an evaluation we're going to ask you to do. So if you don't mind, a couple quick things, keeping yourself muted when you're not speaking. If we are kind of getting delays or freezing, we may have to have folks turn off their video, unless they're speaking, of course. And then you can turn on live captions if you want to watch the words go by, watch the captions. There's 3 dots at the top, kind of to the left of the little video recorder icon. And if you click on that, turn on live captions should be one of the options. And then, yeah, please just be patient with us as we navigate the technology. Sometimes things pop up. Okay. Now I'll turn it over to Claudia.
Good evening, folks. Before we begin, I'd like for us to take a moment to ground ourselves in this space as we start conversation about redistricting. Not physically dividing the land, but the populations to be more equitable with our representation. I'd like to bring your attention to the original stewards of this land with a land acknowledgement. What is a land acknowledgement? Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many Native nations and communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native peoples and non-Natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the lands on which we now live. As we begin, let us acknowledge that we are here on the original homelands of the Dakota people who were forcibly removed from and are still connected to this territory. We honor with gratitude the land and our stewardship of it. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, And I'll hand it over to Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Barkley. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Brooklyn Park, Osseo, and Maple Grove. And we are happy to be a part of this group and welcome you to this community presentation on redistricting. The League is a 3-level organization of women and men, don't forget that, who seeks to improve government and impact public policies through education and advocacy. If you'd like more information about the League, and we hope you do, please check us out on our Facebook page, or I will put our contact information on the chat. Our first speaker tonight is Paul Huffman, Redistricting Coordinator for the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. He's on his Woodbury Cottage Grove League as well, and on that board as well. He's been deeply involved with the census, redistricting, and people-powered fair maps over the last few years. Paul, take it away.
All right, thank you, Carol, for that introduction, and thank you, Josie, for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm here as part of my role with the League of Women Voters, as Carol noted. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to work with a lot of organizations, both on the census through the Census Mobilization Partnership and with the Our Maps Minnesota campaign, which both CAPI and ACER are part of, and we've had the opportunity to work with them on their efforts in mapping communities in support of redistricting in Minnesota. So I appreciate this opportunity to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to see some of the same organizations we've been working with here in the last year or two. Next slide, please. First thing I'll lead off with is Carol mentioned the League of Women Voters. We are a nonpartisan organization. We don't support or oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. We are also always working on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. We are nonpartisan. We are political because things such as redistricting are political processes, both at the city, the county, the state level. So it is part of what we do. And the discussion does become political. But again, we are not partisan in that. We have core principles about effective and fair representation for individuals and communities that span all of those. Next slide, please. What I'm here to do is give you just a high level on redistricting. For those who may not have been exposed to this and wonder, what is it? Why is it important, and why should I care? Next slide. Our government is, as most of you may know, is divided regionally from the highest levels nationally down to the lowest levels locally into representative districts, where representatives are elected based on geographic areas. So at the state level, we've got 8 congressional districts, and the census, which was completed really early in 2021 with the apportionment data, that is what certified we kept our 8 congressional districts by only about 29 people that were counted for the state, but very close. But that shows on the left there are 8 congressional districts. On the right shows our 134 House districts. We also have 67 Senate districts. All of those are elected by geographic areas. The next slide. Then as you work further down, the county commissioners are elected based on geographic areas in Minnesota. 5 or 7 commissioners in counties, depending on population and the size. Those also have maps. Next slide. And then city councils. In Brooklyn Park, as you'll hear, there are 3 city council districts with 2 council members in each district to provide representation for that area. Those maps get redrawn. And then on another slide, in some areas we have school districts, and parts of Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center are part of the Anoka Hennepin School District, which is divided into 6 different districts. So all of these are ways in which your representation on these important government bodies are determined based on where you live and who you vote for in those areas. Next slide. So then the question is, what is redistricting and how does that fit? So after every census, every 10 years, really since 1790 being the first census, there is a determination of how many congressional seats each state gets based on their population. So when this is done, that is something done at the national or federal level, and that's called apportionment. So you may remember hearing about apportionment being done early this year in April was when that finally came out. It was about 4 months late, but that's done federally. After that, based on census and the reapportionment, the states do what's called redistricting, where they determine lines for their congressional delegation, but also lines for their state legislature. Also, in most states are different local redistricting, and we talked about the county commissioners, we talked about city council wards, we talked about some school districts. In Minneapolis, they have park districts. So there's a number of different other governmental bodies that get redistricted based on those census numbers and based on what happens at the state level. One of the things that is important to know is that every state determines its own redistricting process. So these processes differ significantly depending on where you live nationally, and also where you may live within the state. It varies. So next slide. Next slide, please. Now, there's a lot of ways to draw a map. And so, what this shows is that, just for argument's sake, say you have 50 precincts and say there, 30 of them are green, 20 of them are yellow. And so you can draw 5 districts of those precincts in a lot of different ways. And you can draw it in ways that disproportionately represent one or the other. If you think about it, if you have 5 districts, if there's 60% green, 40% yellow, then you ought to have 3 green precincts and 2 yellow precincts. But in fact, you can draw, in this simple example, you can draw a map that has all green districts, or you can draw a map that has 3 yellow districts where there's disproportionate representation, where the voices of the communities, the voices of residents are not being accurately represented. And so when that happens, and when that happens with deliberate intent, that's something we call gerrymandering. So next slide. So gerrymandering is where there's deliberate extreme manipulation of district boundaries to draw a map that provides a political advantage for a party or a group. And that, most recently we hear that talked about a lot with regards to congressional and legislative maps. And that's been places where legislatures and governors draw the maps, and where they can do that without any court and potentially without any other interaction. When you have a party, whatever party it is that controls all of that, then you likely will have some form of partisan manipulation of maps. When that happens, there's, safe partisan districts that result in extreme policies that don't represent the interests of most voters. Now, remember that, when parties choose their candidates, that is done by a narrower base of the electorate than does the election. So say 30% of the population belongs to a party, and of that 30% of the electorate, they choose their candidates. If those maps are drawn to favor one party over the other, then you get basically a party deciding who the representatives are going to be. And so that results in outcomes that aren't representative of the interest. Now, that can happen when there are nonpartisan elections like county commissioners or city councils, when there are shared interests of one group or the other, or where lines are drawn such that the interests of one group or one community are not given adequate voice. Next slide. So it's important in redistricting, and you heard the city councilor talk about communities of interest. Redistricting is about community representation. whose voices are being heard, whose interests are being served. And when groups of community voices are being diluted, they're being cracked, as the word is used, or they're being separated, or if they are isolated and packed together, then those voices may not get adequate interest, may get adequate representation, and then those groups may not get representation. So that is why it's important to make sure the communities and those interests are being heard, and that redistricting reflects those community interests, those community voices. The last thing I'll leave you with is at a national and state level, we talk a lot about party. And I emphasize to people to think about policy, what the policy interests are of those communities, whether it's schools or whether it's transportation, or is it housing, is it infrastructure, is it ensuring a public safety interests are being addressed, healthcare. Those are all things that are important to different groups in different ways. So think about whether those interests are being effectively represented by the way those maps are being drawn. Next slide. Next slide, please. Couple of things. Congressionally, you can see these maps. These are examples of gerrymandering by different political parties. The one on the left is done by Republicans in Ohio to concentrate Democratic voters in a district along the lake. The one on the right is cracking Republican voters in Maryland to disperse them and result in a lack of representation by voters who may vote Republican. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. In Michigan, it's important to understand that gerrymandering and manipulation of maps can have direct impacts on public safety, public health. The Flint water crisis, if you're familiar with that, with the lead in the water in the city of Flint, that is directly related to gerrymandering of the legislative chambers by the Republicans in that case, which had all three branches, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office in Michigan after the 2010 election. They passed a bill to allow the state to establish what's called an emergency manager to take financial control of the city. The people of the state voted to reject that bill. That was something in the Constitution of the state of Michigan. But even though the people of Michigan voted to reject that policy, voted to reject the Republicans on a statewide basis, because of the manipulated maps, the Republicans still retained control of the legislature to reimpose the bill with provisions that prevented it from being recalled by the people, and then established the emergency manager. And that then was what resulted through policy changes by people not elected by the people of Flint, Michigan, that resulted in contamination of the water, impacting the lives of those residents. So again, it's actions by people not accountable to or elected by the people that resulted in that. And this is where, with gerrymandering of any nature, it results in policies not representative of the people. Next slide. In Minneapolis, briefly, there were practices in place where districts, areas, they had very diverse populations. On the left is the Powderhorn area. It's a majority minority area today. On the right is the Cedar Riverside area. I think you're familiar with a majority minority area, and in that part of Minneapolis. Both of those areas prior to 2010 were divided into 4 different wards, with the result that those communities could not get effective representation for their voices. Next slide. In the 2010 election in Minneapolis, they established an advisory commission to the Charter Commission, which, similar to Brooklyn Park, the Charter Commission in Minneapolis draws the maps. And with that, citizen representation, citizen involvement with how those maps were drawn, it resulted in different maps that gave opportunities for representation by those communities, including a first Somali city council member representing Cedar Riverside, the first Hispanic city council member representing the Powderhorn area, the first Hmong city council member. So by having those maps, enable that representation of communities resulted in a much more representative city council. Next slide, please. So in Minnesota, real briefly, how those maps are drawn. Next slide. Three pieces: the people, the principles, the process. Who draws the maps and who makes the decisions? In the state of Minnesota, this is done, as in most states, by the legislature and approved by the governor. Locally, it is generally done by elected officials, county commissioners, city council members, school board members. In Brooklyn Park, you have the benefit that the Charter Commission does the maps and it submits it to the city council for approval and implementation. The Charter Commission, again, isn't an elected body, so that's why it's important to have that citizen involvement, citizen input to the Charter Commission to ensure that the interests of the community are being considered. Principles are those things that are considered to make the map. Now, there's legal principles in Minnesota, but they really revolve around adherence to precinct boundaries, equalizing population, but it doesn't necessarily require things like community input, considering the interests of communities, community of interest, boundaries and areas. So, that's something to make sure that is being considered and addressed. And finally, the process, how the maps are drawn. Minnesota is an outlier nationally in having very little in the way of legal requirements for public involvement and public oversight and public comment on redistricting. In the case locally, there can be provisions for public input, public comment, public review, if local governments make that opportunity available to the public. Next slide. So the timeline, just to be aware, legislative hearings are going on in the state right now. The House is done. The Senate is still having hearings. The Special Redistricting Panel, which is the court, they are having hearings right now at a state level. They had their final hearing on the 26th. Written testimony can be provided through the 29th, which is tomorrow. So you still have time to get in your public comments on state redistricting. And then we have local redistricting, and that's the focus this evening, is what's happening in Brooklyn Park with your city council redistricting. And this is where the city and the county governments decide on their process. A key milestone is in February, where the courts most likely will announce the final redistricting for the state, which then allows the city government to finalize their new district maps. The deadline for the city is the end of March, and then the county is the end of April. So that gives you a sense of when the city needs to be done and when your opportunities are for engagement. Next slide. Next slide, please. So that's what I have. Very high level, very complicated topic, and I'll open for any questions. But I appreciate your time and attention. I appreciate this opportunity. Thanks, Josie.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, so if you have any questions for Paul, now is really the time because he's not able to stay with us for the whole time. And Paul, there is a question in the chat, someone looking for the contact info about how to make that public comment before tomorrow. You got, okay, that's it, perfect. Any questions of Paul?
I have a question for Paul. This is Hulda Hiltsley, a community leader in the Brooklyns. So for those individuals who are thinking about possibly running for office, how does this impact them and their planning process in terms of really engaging the community?
That's a great question. The running for public office, one of the things that happens, and with the way things have gone in Minnesota, the courts have issued the maps both of the last two cycles, both in 2012 and 2002, where the result that caucuses generally happen prior to that. And so people can file. The filing deadline is after the maps are issued. If you're looking at legislative districts. So you're going to have to wait to know what district you're in until after those maps get released. And what happens generally with caucuses is that the parties will have a caucus and then they'll re-caucus depending on what happens with those boundaries.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great. Other questions of Paul?
I will be on for about another 10 minutes if there's other questions in chat. But again, thank you, Josie.
There is one in the chat. I don't know, Paul, if you can see it, but she's asking if redistribution lines that are being kind of drawn now, if there's any risk of those being gerrymandered, or, you know, we don't have all the maps yet, but just if you could, I don't know, speculate or, you know, say anything about that.
No, that's a great question. And because we have not had a united government under a single party for the last 60 years, we have not had partisan gerrymandering in Minnesota. So, and you will sometimes hear elected officials say, oh, see, everything works great. We haven't had gerrymandering. Well, that's because no party has had the opportunity to gerrymander in Minnesota. The DFL tried in 1992, but that got figured out, and the governor ended up vetoing the maps. So we have not had gerrymandering at that level in Minnesota. The current maps are being drawn by the courts, and it's extremely unlikely the legislature will agree, so the state maps aren't gerrymandered. Now, I will say, as at a local level, because there's not parties, and you got to look at who's drawing the maps and how they are aligning interests. There was one county, which will remain nameless, I'm working with right now with the league, and their city is divided amongst all of the major city in that county is divided amongst all the commissioners in that county, which results in dividing the voices of that city, which is in most counties outside the metro. The cities in those counties are more diverse than the county as a whole, which then impacts community representation. So there are counties where, and possibly cities, but there are counties certainly where those maps are not ideal for representations of some of the communities. And it's important to have that engagement. So I think what I can say is, you know, you're not going to see gerrymandered maps at a state level because of the legal process we're in. At a local level, I think that's a great opportunity, especially counties, for public involvement.
Great. I just want to thank you, Paul. Or did you can speak this question if you want to, Shanasha, otherwise I'll say it for you. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that how you correct it locally, that is really a matter of public involvement, and I think that's part of what you know, the city is going to talk about. And I can do a whole different discussion on local redistricting and opportunity engagement. I put in the chat a link to our website. There is a local redistricting action kit there that gives kind of a roadmap on how to engage in local redistricting, and with resources and tools and information. And I will put my email address in the chat if you want to reach out to me separately. I am always happy to talk to anybody anytime about redistricting.
Awesome. Yeah, I just really want to thank you for being here, Paul. When I started talking to people about redistricting, your name just kept coming up, and it was like, you got to get Paul. That guy's got the info. I was like, okay, great. I'm going to try to get him. And luckily you were available. So thanks for being here. I think I wanted to recognize too that Councilmember West Hafner has joined us. So thanks for being here. I think we're ready to go to Christina, Victor, and Richard from Cappy and Acer, respectively.
That's good. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for having our organizations here tonight, and thank you to Paul for such a great presentation. My name is Christina Doan, and I'm the Director of Public Policy at Cappy USA. I'm also joined here with colleagues, my colleague Victor Yang, who's our Civic Engagement Coordinator, as well as our partner organization, Richard Jennis, who's the community organizer for ACER, and you'll hear from both of them as we move along in the slides here. So next slide, please. So I'll first talk about CAPI's redistricting efforts. I could say that this is very similar to what ACER has done and what Richard has done over at ACER. Both our organizations have been leading members of the Our Maps Minnesota campaign, which is a community mapping effort in partnership with 12 organizations. And those 12 organizations represent BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous, people of color communities across the state. We have done this in partnership with the League of Women Voters as well as the Minnesota Council on Foundations. And we've been engaging in the mapping process with our communities since earlier this summer. As part of that process, as Paul mentioned, the principles of redistricting, we really wanted to emphasize alongside those principles the concept of communities of interest, because we have witnessed over the years and in many different states and many different cities that oftentimes community and community voices are left out of the redistricting process. So for us, we worked with many different communities to make sure that in this 2021 redistricting process that we make sure all our community voices were heard and the people that we engaged with during the 2020 census could connect this to the next process of redistricting. Together with these 12 organizations, we each mapped our individual communities, and we have created what is called a unity map, and that consists of over 40 maps that have been developed across the state with these 12 organizations to really have a comprehensive map that shows where our communities of color are located across the state and how we think our communities reside and where those new district lines should be drawn. Finally, one other thing that both our organizations have done is to provide that direct oral and written testimony to both the House Redistricting Committee, sending emails to the Senate Redistricting Committee, as well as testifying in the Minnesota court system for the special redistricting panel. And so these were opportunities that are super important to make sure that our communities were represented, were heard, and also to share the maps that we had produced. Next slide, please. So some of you might be asking, what is a community of interest? So really, it's a neighborhood or an area whose residents have shared culture, history, policy concerns that would benefit from being represented in the same district. And why are these communities of interest important? It's really because it gives an opportunity for community members to tell their stories, to tell what issues and concerns impact their communities, and to really discuss, do they have proper representation, and are they properly represented, and are their policymakers accessible to them when they are seeking change. And really, the communities of interest is an important process to make sure that we organize our communities. It only happens every 10 years. And we know that these new district lines will impact our communities for quite some time. Next slide, please. So this slide here represents specifically who CAPI engaged with in this process. Like I said, we worked with 12 different BIPOC-led organizations who worked in many different communities, and this is just a sampling of who CAPI engaged with. And I'll have Richard share who they engaged with as well. So for us, it was extremely important to map the Asian Minnesotan community because there was no one else out there that was mapping the community. So we identified this as a gap, and then we had several mapping sessions in which we recruited community members to come learn about redistricting and then do an actual mapping session. And a lot of these sessions were held in language, and so people who may not have access to the entire redistricting process, may not know how to navigate it, were able to partake in this really important process in the language that they were most comfortable with. And then now I'll turn it over to my colleague Victor, who will go through some of the maps that we produced specifically to the Brooklands area.
Hi, everyone. So this map that you can see here, you can see that's marked in blue as well as, believe orange is what the color is what I'm seeing here. So the areas marked in blue is our Lao community, and anywhere in the areas marked as orange are where the Hmong community decided where their boundary lines are. So the process of this, we ask community members about, what defines your community, what are some like geographical boundaries, such as highways, parks, churches, stores, any points of interest that you can see there on the right hand side. So those little dots there mark like areas that the community will or points of interest that the communities will tend to go to. So I believe there's some high schools, some shopping centers, grocery stores, parks, as well as some churches there, as well as CAPI USA. Uh, so this is like we after like finding out what defines their community, like the process of like what does community mean to you? Who do you identify as part of your community? Are there others that you would define as well that not does not reflect, your demographic? Once we figure out those sorts of ordeals, we then talk about issues in the community as well. One two key issues in the community that we talked a lot about for the Brooklands area was public safety, as well as the water quality in the Brooklands area. Next slide, please. So this is like where the current state house boundaries are. As you can see, the Hmong community is fairly spread out in between three different Minnesota State House districts. I believe it's 36B, 40A, and 40B. So you can kind of see like the community there is pretty staggered out in three different areas. What we tried our best as we were mapping our communities in later sessions is how do we map these groups together, or how can we map this group entirely so that they're are within their own districts, or they feel like they aren't split into three different communities. Next slide, please. And we also did that as well with the Lao community. Also another thing we wanted to mention here too is that because the community is so in like in so many places are so spread out. Another thing that we also wanted to mention too, that it's also split between congressional districts 3 and 5. These districts are like, as redistrict happens, we do our best as we can to make sure that these communities are kept together instead of split into different areas, so that their voices do matter and they are being counted towards the next few years for representation. I'll now hand it off to our colleague at Acer, Richard, to talk about his mapping sessions.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to Paul for being here as well and for speaking before us. So Acer looked at in our mapping sessions some similar considerations, keeping communities together in common points of interest. We were looking at the Brooklands, Brooklyn Park, and Brooklyn Center, and how we could best serve communities and keep people with common views, common interests, and common points of action together. So the Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center areas were too big to keep into one house district. So we knew that they'd be split into two, but there is a strong possibility of keeping them within one Senate district. Part of our work, we composed a testimony asking the Minnesota judiciary to consider keeping these districts united as much as possible. We recommended a borderline on going horizontally on the 73rd Avenue North line that would divide the area north and south. And then some things we were looking at were communities in the area, underprivileged regions, that were underrepresented and that could really benefit from collaborative action, and particularly communities that were largely immigrant communities, communities of color, BIPOC communities, and many of them were immigrants specifically from Africa. So we wanted to keep them in the same area as the businesses and the locations they frequented, so that they could be well maintained and with each other as well, so that they could collectively take action, and so that representation would be responsive, especially because in some instances it had not been as responsive as they needed previously. So this is a look at the Minnesota State House current boundary, and then you have Brooklyn Park highlighted in yellow, maintained largely within that boundary. And then I think there should be some other maps as well. Okay, so a little more comprehensive. So now we have the intersecting community IDs and main communities of interest. So we were looking at the state Senate and the House Senate and the current boundary. And again, we knew that we would have to split up the House, but we tried to do that in a way that would keep similar communities together and immigrant communities together. We were looking at apartment places that we had visited, where we had connected with people and asked them what was important to them and what their values were. We looked at large communities like the Georgetown apartments in Huntington, and we tried our best to keep them in the same Senate district while dividing the House in such a way that immigrant communities could stay together and that people could stay with the businesses, the houses of worship, and within the communities that they had come to value and where they had come to make a life. And then there should be one more map as well. Thank you. So now we're looking at, this is just one example, but residents of Georgetown Park Apartments, which is an expansive apartment complex within that boundary. So it's home to many residents. It's a largely BIPOC community and a largely immigrant community. And there is a collective interest in shared representation. We actually went there to do voter registration as a group. And we saw dozens of residents who are not registered to vote, who hadn't been reached or contacted before, but were eager to. And we encountered so much action and willingness to take part among that community. People were very apt to register to vote, to ask great questions about representation, what they can do to be heard, and to voice the interests and concerns of the community. And that just reaffirmed why it's so important to keep them together and why it's so important that BIPOC and immigrant communities have a voice. Yeah. So here we have a more holistic look at the Brooklyns. We have both Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park, and the Minnesota State House, where the current boundary is. And our goal, again, since the population is so big, is to split the areas into 2 districts horizontally along that 73rd Avenue North, and then to make sure that immigrant communities, to the fullest extent possible, can stick together, and that the Brooklyns will be able to unite in common action in the Senate and with each other in their respective House districts. It's a pretty expansive area. It's growing as well. It represents a diverse community, a community that's very willing to take action, and a community that's been terrific at voicing their concerns, suggestions, and considerations throughout all the civic engagement and all the voter registration that we've done in the area. Yeah. So,
Great. Thanks so
yeah,
much.
absolutely.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, happy to take questions.
I just think it's so neat how you did that community organizing work and then used it for your advocacy work. And really kind of, you were involved in this redistricting stuff, early on to be involved with that legislative process. So it's neat to see how that worked out.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
we wanted to get a good up close look at like the residents and what was most important to them. So yeah, I was really happy we could incorporate that.
yeah, there's a request for to share the maps. If you're okay with this level of detail from the slides, I'm going to send the slides out.
Yeah.
So if you didn't RSVP, then I don't have your email necessarily. So put your email in the chat. But yeah, happy to share them. Any questions for Cappy or Acer? Okay. Oh, cool. She's going to share the links as well. Thanks, Christina. Okay, well, you can kind of see.
Paul also sent out the link. Where's the People Powered Fair Maps Action Kit? It has all the data of like where the 2020 census data is.
Perfect. Yeah, and we could maybe put, if we haven't already, the Our Maps Minnesota has quite a bit of cool information about the whole process. So that's great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. You can kind of see where we're going. We kind of started big picture and then they kind of did some regional work, and now we're gonna kind of narrow into Brooklyn Park. So next we have John Nergy. He's the city's GIS coordinator, and he's going to share some slides about Brooklyn Park's 2020 census results.
All right, thank you, Josie. Yep, my name is John Nergy. I'm the GIS coordinator for Brooklyn Park. I have been with the city since 2012, so I actually started right after the last redistricting happened, so I'm excited to get to be involved in it this time. So yeah, I'm just here to share kind of census data, and which is a huge piece of what's going to help us help inform redistricting. Just for a quick background, for those that don't know or want a refresher, so US conducts a census every 10 years. New for 2020, there was an option to submit your information online. That was the first time we've ever been able to do that. Statewide, the response rate was about 75%, but thanks to all of the organizing work to get Brooklyn Park, the Brooklyn Park community involved, we surpassed that and had nearly 80% participation in the census, which is really, really good. And I don't know if you remember seeing the news or not, but Minnesota just like barely held on to the number of congressional seats it had, thanks to the participation that we had. On the next slide, as far as why we're excited about the census, besides me being a data nerd and bouncing off the walls on August 12th when the data came out, it helps us understand how our community is changing. There are hundreds of billions of dollars that go out every year in federal funding that relies on census data in order to determine where that funding goes. It helps us design policies, programs. Again, it just helps us understand. Claudia remembers me like running past her cube and shouting out the census data is here. It was like Christmas morning. It helps us with land use planning. And then, of course, it helps us with redistricting. So let's jump into some of the data. If you haven't seen it yet, Brooklyn Park's 2020 population is 86,478. And then we've got the data on this chart showing going back to 1980. So we've continued to have consistent, steady growth in the city. And then on the next slide, you can see not only did we grow by, close to 11,000 people, we actually surpassed forecasted projections. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to continue beyond this forecast into 2040. It could just be that we're growing earlier than expected, and then we'll plateau out. But it was pretty cool to see that the city not only grew as much as we thought, but it actually grew by a little bit more. And speaking of those growth rates, on the next slide, we always talk about we're the 6th largest city in Minnesota. We are still the 6th largest city in Minnesota. But you can see the blue bars were 2010 population, the green bars are 2020. We don't have Minneapolis and St. Paul on here because they're just so much bigger. They would make this chart not as interesting. But you can see that we're within, I think the number is 219 people of Duluth. They grew by, I believe it was like 1%, and we grew by 14%, which was similar to Plymouth. We're starting to inch up on Bloomington as well. So not only did we grow a lot, we also grew percentage-wise. We grew as much or more than the other larger cities in Minnesota. Next slide. Another significant thing that happened was for the 2010 census, we were pretty much an even 50-50 split between our white and our Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC community. We have continued to diversify in Brooklyn Park, and we are now in 2020 up to just over 61% BIPOC and about 39% white. So we have seen that diversity continue to grow since 1990. It's actually really staggering. It did, you can see by the line, it slowed down a little bit, but it's still, our growth has continued. I just started looking at, there's so much data, and yet it's not even all the data, but just starting looking also at like adult versus youth population, so we can start thinking about how this trend will continue. But yeah, 61% BIPOC community now. And then this is actually my last slide. I'm a very short presentation here, but that's fine. We are also, unsurprisingly, more diverse than the metro area. I really like this chart because it shows how significantly more diverse we are when you see the difference between us and the region, which I believe is the 7-county metro. And even then, I think, you know, there's just been such great content from everybody who's presented tonight talking about communities of interest and things like that, because you can see, you know, these are the race categories that the Census Bureau uses. So we know in Brooklyn Park that, you know, saying the Black community or saying the Asian community grossly under, it does not really describe our community. There's so much more diversity within each of these groups, which is why we're really excited to be having this conversation about communities of interest. I know that like apartment communities came up. So we're excited to have the data. It's really great data. We only get once every 10 years, but at the same time, we're going into it knowing that it is not complete data. It is kind of flyover data. And that is why, you know, community input is going to be so important to redistricting. I really just want to echo everything that's been said so far, which has been fantastic. So we have this data to inform us, but we really need the community's help in helping us know what we don't know. And I think that's my last slide. So yeah, I really flew through those, but happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you, John. We're lucky to have John. He is like our data guru and super focused on racial equity and community engagement. So has kind of all those lenses on it. And he'll be really involved working with the charter subcommittee on the redistricting work. Any questions for John? Okay. We have some kudos. I know I have to show everyone how to do applause. Do you know how to do applause on the top? If you click on the little guy with a person with the hand up, you can do hearts and thumbs up and applause. So thank you, John. Okay, so I think we're ready to go to, I think I have Dennis on. Yes, great. Well, spotlight Dennis to talk about redistricting from the Charter Commission. Go ahead.
Thank you, Josie, and welcome to everybody that is here tonight. I'm Dennis Sakara, and I'm the current chair of the Brooklyn Park City Charter Commission. And tonight I'd like to briefly present the Charter Commission's role in the redistricting process and discuss and hopefully take any questions that you may have. So to begin with, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So following the 2020 census, the Brooklyn Park Charter Commission began the process of redistricting within the city, and we began that process back in March. The city has seen an increase in population since the last census, and that was discussed previously by John. And so the process cannot be completed until the legislature has completed congressional and legislative redistricting. And as you heard from previous presenters, that is expected to be done in the middle of February, end of February. I would like to point out that the city council is unable to do any redistricting of its own until the Charter Commission has an opportunity to present a redistricting proposal. And of course, the City Charter Commission cannot present a proposal until the legislature has finished its work. So we are in what I call a holding pattern. So we are just pending the legislature. To assure equal representation across all city council districts or wards, it will be necessary to reestablish certain district and/or voting precinct boundaries, and I'll discuss that in just a moment. And just what follows is a summary of how the Charter Commission shall proceed with a process that is rather complex. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are some guidelines put out by the Minnesota Secretary of State's office, and those guidelines constitute the redistricting principles in Brooklyn Park, as well as in other municipalities. So precinct boundaries should follow school district boundaries as much as possible. And that's to prevent situations where you can vote in national elections where you're in one precinct, but then you'd have to cross to another precinct to vote in the school board election during the same election. So we don't want that, and we'll try to avoid that as much as possible. Precinct boundaries will follow census block boundaries or other physical features. And basically, census blocks are essentially the building blocks of precincts. Precinct boundaries shall follow legislative or congressional boundaries. And again, once those boundaries are redrawn, that has a big impact on how our map will look in Brooklyn Park. Council districts or wards will be bounded by precinct lines, which are drawn on census blocks and follow school district boundaries. So we kind of start with the census block, and from there we group them together into precincts, and precincts are grouped then into wards. So we go from very tiny little entities to larger ones, and from there we can go on to state House and Senate, and congressional as well. And council districts or wards shall be as equal in population as practicable, in keeping with the Equal Representation Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, equal as practicable means a few different things. In Brooklyn Park, it basically means that there will be no more than a 5% deviation from the mean district population. And the way we calculate the mean is that we take all three districts, or we take the total population of the city first, and then divide it by 3, and that gives us the mean. And then what we try to do is redraw the boundaries so that way there are the same number of people in each ward, if possible. We know that that may not be 100% possible, but we are required to make sure that the differences in population are no more than 5% from the mean. And the mean, I believe, right now is 28,826. And so therefore, there can't be a difference in population more greater than 14 or 1,500, either above or below that level. I would point out that cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul have a 10% deviation requirement. So when their city ward populations, increased by more or greater than 10% above their mean, they must redistrict. Cities like Brooklyn Park, which are below 100,000 in population, are not bound by that. But we are using the 5% figure because it was used last time and is used commonly throughout cities in Minnesota with populations the size of Brooklyn Park. And again, this information comes to us from the redistricting guide that's put out by the Secretary of State's office. Next slide, please. So how is this done? In a nutshell, first we reestablish or confirm precinct boundaries. And by reestablish or confirm, if we must reestablish a boundary, that means that we need to change it. If we confirm a boundary, that means we leave it alone. So the first thing we do in this process is obtain maps from the Osseo, Anoka, Hennepin, and Robbinsdale school districts. And from there, we also obtain the maps of legislative and congressional boundaries from the legislature or from the court. And then we work with the city to draft possible maps with precinct and district boundaries in accordance with the principles that I discussed in the previous slide and with statute. So the first thing we do is reestablish precincts, and then we reestablish ward boundaries on those reestablished precincts if necessary. We, of course, incorporate community feedback into the final redistricting map. And I would add that there will be an opportunity for community comment after the city council has received our proposal as per the ordinance process. So the people, the residents of the community will have a chance to, communicate with us directly prior to the map being drawn, and also as the city council is deliberating. The redistricting subcommittee then sends the map to the full charter commission for approval. So once we've received all the maps, the redistricting subcommittee works with the city to come up with a map or several map scenarios, and then presents them to the charter commission, the full commission, and then we decide on what we think is the best, and then we send that as a recommendation to the city council. That's the process in a nutshell. Next, please. And so we anticipate a two-part recommendation due to the short time frame involved, unusually short due to the complications of COVID and getting the census done on time and the census data release being very late. So the first part of our recommendation will concern the 3 current city council wards and precincts. And then the second part of our recommendation will ask the city council to consider expanding the number of at-large council districts for a number of reasons. One is if the city's population is no longer evenly divisible by the number of council districts, in this case 3. Secondly, if it's the only way to achieve the operational definition of equal as practicable, and that kind of ties in with the previous, the previous bullet point there. And if it's the only way that it can increase representation of potentially underrepresented populations. So we've heard a lot of discussion this evening about communities of interest and trying to keep communities of interest together and trying to give voice to populations or communities that may be underrepresented. And so we will encourage the city council to take a look at and we'll only do it if it will be the best way to preserve communities of interest within the city. And so that concludes my part of the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. As you can see, there's my name and our redistricting committee subcommittee members, Terry Fufa and David Williams. And I would just mention that the Charter Commission does meet on the second Wednesday of every month. Our meeting minutes are put on the city's website, so you can read them. And public is certainly free to attend our meetings. They're held at City Hall. So at this time, I'm glad to take any questions.
Great, thank you. I did want to recognize too, I think the city clerk, Devin Montero, is on, and I don't know if, I guess folks can see Mr. Fufa and Mr. Williams, but there's a couple other Charter Commission members. I don't know if you want to come on camera just for the transparency of knowing kind of who is this Charter Commission anyways. I thank you for being here and being part of the process. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of wave and say, hey, yeah, there's Devin and Susan. Teferi, great. Any questions about the city process or for the Charter Commission? I just appreciate that, you know, the city only does this every 10 years, and then it's quite a heavy lift for this volunteer body. So I just really want to give kudos to the Charter Commission for getting up to speed really quickly and really taking on this task. Of course, we're just at the beginning. It's going to be a lot of meetings from here on out, but thank you for doing that. And I'll just say, as the community engagement manager, we will do a whole community engagement process about this. We're basically kicking it off tonight. I think what's unique this year is we got the census data so late that it's going to be a quick turnaround by the time, as he mentioned, we get all those maps from all the other entities that we need, so that we have the data that we need to the lines that we need to work with. So he kind of alluded to it, but we do expect to release kind of draft maps, get input on those, all of that. It's just going to be a really tight time frame, likely in that kind of February, March, because then we have to bring it, the council has to approve it by March. But as Dennis said, it's kind of a multi-point process. Like, we're taking input now, Charter Commission will take input now, and then throughout the whole process, we'll be able to get a little bit more specific later on this winter. And then of course, you can engage with the council as well, as they're deliberating it, right? So there's multiple points, and we'll be creating a web page and making that all a lot clearer. This is just kind of the kickoff, like I said. Okay, any questions? Just want to give you a second. Because we're not quite done yet. I do have some questions of you I want to hear. We do want to get your input, your feedback as much as we can tonight, but and just so that people don't dash off before, we do have a little short eval online, and this is another opportunity for you to share your input for the Charter Commission. There's a question or two in there, and then I would take that and get that to the Charter Commission. So thanks, Claudia, for putting it in the chat. But you just heard like a little over an hour of information about all this redistricting stuff. And so we'd just love to know what you learned about redistricting tonight. You could even put it in the chat, or you could just speak up. And if you have any thoughts on communities of interest that should be kept together in Brooklyn Park, kind of how you identify, how you define a community of interest, we'd love to hear that. And then just anything else, suggestions, feedback that you have for their Charter Commission, what you want them to keep in mind as they come up with redistricting kind of draft maps that we'll be bringing out to the community. So just open it up. Go ahead, Devin.
Oh, thanks, Josie. I just wanted to say that the pre-map work by CAPI, ACER, and the other organizations are going to be very helpful for the Charter Commission on the communities of interest.
Do you want to take this question, Devin, from the chat? How people join the Charter Commission?
Oh, yes, you can visit brooklynpark.org, look under the Commissions tab to fill out a Charter Commission application. Again, The difference between the Charter Commission and the other commissions is that you're appointed by the district judge, Hennepin County District Judge, versus being appointed by the city council. So it is a very special, not to say the others are special as well, but this is an independent body. You'll get appointed by the district judge, or you can go to City Hall, pick up a paper application at the customer service desk.
Great. Yeah, I'll just open it up. If there's anyone who was involved with redistricting in the past and wants to share any lessons learned or any, questions or any answers that you might have to these questions on the screen, feel free to pipe in.
Got a question for ACER and CEAP in regards to their engagement. So it's obviously a lot of work that you guys put into engaging the community, but my question is, what was your biggest challenge in terms of engaging communities of interest, in terms of getting data, getting the information that you guys wanted? And to follow up on that, how can community leaders like myself participate in helping with those efforts and really engaging those communities?
I can take a stab at that question. Thanks for the question. I would say one of our challenges in this process, it's like extremely difficult to try to map our communities in this like Zoom Teams environment. So we did end up holding many of our sessions in person, just so that we could easily like bridge language barriers and have someone like immediately help with some of that, some of the language barriers. But I would say like, given like the circumstances and the environment in which we're in, it still felt like we were still not able to fully include everyone that wanted to participate, either because of technology barriers or just access. And that was, I think, frustrating for us because we recognize that the redistricting process in it of itself is inaccessible oftentimes to our communities, and then we also don't want to add to that. So I would say that is one challenge. Another challenge and ways for communities to really get involved is to know even to who to contact and what type of testimony is that they can provide. So oftentimes out of our mapping sessions, we had people who were like had never heard of redistricting, but really, really wanted to make sure that their voices mattered, but they didn't want to necessarily go to a hearing or testify in person. And so then we had to take the extra step to help people write their testimonies, help them submit that. And I think that's something to encourage like community members to partake in that process. And there's not just one way to participate in that process. Victor or Richard, have anything?
No, I think you pretty much covered our end for Cappy.
Sure, and yeah, nothing to add on my end. That's a good description.
Great, thank you. That was a great question. Any other questions for Charter Commission folks, Cappy, Acer?
Josie?
Yeah.
I'm just curious on the second one here. Who would you identify as communities of interest who should be kept together in Brooklyn Park? But we just heard from Dennis that the mean is 28,826, and that's how we have to do the redistricting in Brooklyn Park if necessary. And I was just wondering how that is related to the 28,826.
Sure, I'm
I
not
think
the
I
expert on this. I'll let someone else answer. Anyone that wants to can answer.
Sure. I don't know if you can hear me. I believe it's Gordy I'm talking to.
Yes.
So
Thank you,
that's what
Dennis.
it said. So it sounds like good to hear your voice again, Gordy. So to answer your question, the 28,826. Well, first of all, let me backtrack. In the city charter, we are required to redistrict on the basis of population at this time only. Communities of interest are not listed in our charter at this time. And as far as whether or not we need to include them, that in the charter, that might be a question for the city attorney, if we can proceed without that. But essentially what we will attempt to do is the 28,826 is the mean. And therefore we need to have 3 wards that have roughly that population or no more than 5% difference. As far as keeping communities of interest together, that, again, at this point, without a community of interest map, and without any further data from school districts and from the legislature, I really can't say whether or not certain communities of interest will be kept together and certain communities of interest will be split. And at this point, I know that at our last meeting, Council Representative Pa had suggested that the boundary of her district, the West District, be adjusted so many of the apartment complexes can be more of them can be under the same ward as opposed to split differently. So that's an example of a community of interest. The apartment dwellers, apartment complexes, of example of a community of interest that is in this kind of the same general geographic area, the southern part of our city, but happens to be split by the current council district boundaries. Whether or not we will be able to unite and all of those, I can't say one way or another at this point, but we do recognize that. And so, but to answer your question, for right now, we are only required to redistrict on the basis of population. But as we go forward with our generating various map scenarios, we will attempt to, in the final product that we present, keep communities of interest like that intact as much as possible. So that way they are perhaps more adequately represented. Again, we will do our best. There's a lot of variables that we work with. And, it will just, I can't say one way or another how it will all turn out at this point.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it. I mean, that's
Sure.
the way I understood that the charter looked at, and I thought maybe something had been changed. But
no,
at
there
this
is a,
point,
as I understand, there's some movement to have that changed at the state level to include communities of interest in municipal redistricting as well. And I haven't heard anything further on that. We can certainly, put together a draft an ordinance to present to the city council to amend section 2.04 to include that as part of the redistricting criteria. But again, that would take place probably next year and would be in effect for, I guess, 2024.
okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Hi, this is Councilwoman Susan. Thank you, Chair Zakaria, for your explanation. They're very well explained, actually. I wanted to kind of clarify just a little bit and add to what Chair Zakaria had talked a little bit about. One of my, what I believe is one of the communities of interest we need to look at is apartment renters. I really believe that apartment renters are need to have more representation and a more equitable voice in city policies that affects them, because safe and dignified housing has been a concern and an issue among our apartment renters here in this city. and I think really honestly across the nation. But one thing is so important that our communities of interest are well represented, and that they do have the representation, whether it's at city or state or federal level, and that is equitable. So to Chair Sakarda's point, those are some of the things we're going to be looking at as we look at redistricting, to making sure that one, they could be categorized as a community of interest, but also we don't want to lump them all together, necessarily apartment renters I'm talking about, because sometimes that gives them less representation than more representation. So that'll be a conversation we'll have further, and I invite the whole entire community to be part of that conversation as we continue to meet more. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that additional piece.
I could follow up with that, Josie. Yeah, the idea, the Charter Commission did look at some redistricting scenarios from the previous redistricting process 10 years ago. And that did involve looking at expanding the number of city council districts from 3 to as many as 6. And looking into that again, or revisiting those scenarios, could provide a possible solution to this, one, providing equal representation, but also providing equitable representation. So, that's the reason that we looked at those again as a commission, and why we may present those again to the city council for consideration.
Yeah, it's kind of a phased approach. It's like we have such a quick turnaround. Almost need to keep it to the 3 districts for this immediate redistricting, but as you say, there's an opportunity beyond for the council to really relook at everything. Okay. Any other questions? Comments about redistricting? Okay. Well, super. We're right about at our time. So I just really want to thank all the presenters that joined us. It was quite the crew that we had. It's kind of like a VIP. Yes. So yeah, a round of applause for everyone that presented. And then thank you all for attending. And I hope you'll continue to be part of the process. Like I said, this is just kind of the beginning, at least at the Brooklyn Park level, right? So obviously follow it at all the different levels of government, but in terms of Brooklyn Park, you'll be seeing more information come in. Did you have something, Gordy? Is your hand raised?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for all the information that we received, and I'm looking forward to see what's going on from here.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so if you don't mind, please do the quick couple question evaluation form. The link is in the chat. We really appreciate your help so we can continue to improve. And then if you RSVP, did the little registration, I will send the slides out so you have them. But if you found us another way and didn't register, just put your email in the chat and then I'll make sure you get it. So I think that's it. We'll stop the recording. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having us.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.